drink. All right. Hello. Now we're official. So, thanks for coming to class. It's good to see you. I trust a few more people will come, but if not, we don't need them. They can watch the recording anyway, right? The good people are here. Other people, no, they're all good. So, hopefully everything's going well. I know you've got a lot of stuff going on. AP exams coming in the next week or so. So hopefully you're caught up here. That's part of the reason, honestly, I want you to get caught up before that started, because once your AP exams start, plus you're a month from graduation, yeah, you don't need to put anything off anymore than you've already put it off. So, and I also don't need to put grading off any more than I've put it off. So um, I put up the additional questions, so we'll look at that here for a second. We'll look at the weekly question and then we'll proceed. So, oh, there's a lot of stuff up there. Weekly question. Here we go. All right. So this week's weekly question is, what was the basic premise of the Confederate government? What advantages did the Confederacy have, and why did its leaders think victory would be theirs? Most of this is kind of 546 and following. Truthfully, we'll get to this more next time than this time. We should start off class with a discussion of the weekly question on Thursday. So, but if you need a head start, I would look around 546 to look more at the premise of the government. I think the advantages, the military advantages are, we'll talk about those a little bit today. And they're a little more general. I think the basic premise of the government's a little more specific. So if I'm answering this question, stuff that I would include, why did they secede? What's different? Where did they get the basis of their constitution? How is it different than the US Constitution? How did they elect their officials? Who was their first president? I would talk about, just how generally does it work? What rights did they want to protect? What rights did they think belonged to individuals and states? And does the government operate in a more open and democratic way, more states' rights kind of way than the US government, or does it seem to be a little harsher and a little more confiscatory? How's that for a word? Are they willing to take your stuff without your permission? Weirdly enough, the answer is going to be yes on that one. And I think that's kind of the irony of the Confederate government, is they really want to be more of a states' rights kind of group, and they definitely want to preserve slavery. That's not going to be a huge shock to anybody, and they'll certainly write that into their constitution. But the way that it operates is going to be a little different maybe than you would expect. Also, you can mention what their foreign policy was, if they were able to make agreements with foreign countries, either military stuff. Did they get any foreign countries to support their war effort? Were they able to keep trade policy with foreign countries, or did the North interfere with that a little? That's probably what happened. And then advantages, and why did they think they would win? And we'll talk probably a little more about advantages and why they thought they would win today. And then I think next week is the week you guys have already said that your book review is due on the Friday. And then the week after is your chapter 15 questions. So that'll give you next week as well, if you're not doing the book review, or even if you are, to work on the additional question, which we'll go over here in a sec. I'm checking in whoever just came in, so I don't forget later. All right, and I realized I put the directions on here. Maybe I can take those off. Excuse me. There we go. So this is the, what do we call this? The optional assignment. That's what we call it, optional assignment. So you don't have to do this. It's worth 10 points if you do it. All right, so you're getting it's pretty open. Explain one extremely important event mentioned in this class that was not directly a part of a weekly question. Explain what the event was, when, where, who was involved, and why it was a significant part of US history, the 1301 part of US history, from colonization to 1877. what I'm trying to do, I maybe didn't say it as eloquently as I would like. You don't have to explain how that one event impacted the entire period. I just want you to make sure that that event impacts US history and is within that period. It has to happen before 1877. Okay. And this could be about a person, it could be about somebody's presidency, it could be about a war there wasn't a direct question about. So that's probably War of 1812, Mexican War. You could talk about Native American policy. You could talk about, I don't know, there's a bunch of stuff. I think you could talk about a Supreme Court case that you thought was important, an invention you thought was crucial. Yeah, anything that I didn't ask you about that you thought was a big deal. Also, since the Civil War chapter is pretty open, you know, the chapter 14 question is really about the Confederacy. It does leave it open for you to talk about the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. You could talk about Lincoln's presidency. You could talk about secession. There's a lot of stuff in there that you could talk about. So, you know, the goal in part was to give you options. I know sometimes that makes it worse because you go like, I don't know what to talk about. But, you know, just pick something you thought was interesting or a person you thought was interesting. I think it'd be super easy to write about the importance of the first presidency of, you know, the leadership of George Washington, or the importance of the Bill of Rights, or, you know, I think you could find something. I hope so. Yeah, that's the goal. And so that one's worth 10 points. I already forgot when this one is due. I think this is due on the 10th. So the Monday after the book review. So, yeah. All right. And then next week we'll go over some stuff, but we can also go over anything specifically that you might need to hear. Honestly, the plan really is to get most of the lectures done by next week, because I know that last week of class could be kind of hit or miss because of AP exams, I think. I think that's, yeah, at some point in the next 2 weeks, it's not this week, but next week and the week after, am I right about that, or AP exams? So I know I put it on the syllabus, it's just not in my brain because I don't teach that anymore. So it doesn't matter as much to me, no offense, but. All right. Also, hey, is there anybody in here that has to take the STAR test? Because there are people in my middle of the day class that have to. Is anybody STAR test US history? Okay. All right. If there is, I can give you tips on that, but mostly the tip is just read the questions. That's mostly it, and take your time. All right. Let's talk about the stuff. Talking about the stuff. All right. Chapter 14 is Civil War. Civil War. And my guess is, if you know stuff about US history, sorry, just checking. You know stuff about US history, the Civil War is probably one of the things you know quite a bit about. There's lots of movies about it, people reenact it, you know, it's fun. As long as you weren't in it, it's fun. Okay, so Civil War is 1861 to 65. It spans the first presidency and into the second presidency of Lincoln, although Lincoln doesn't last as long as, he lasts about the exact same time as the Civil War. He's assassinated right before it ends, but knowing that it's about to end. Yeah, there's no vote at the end. So Lincoln's leadership is pretty crucial for the North during this time period. I think if you study it more carefully than we probably will for this class, one of the things you would notice about Lincoln is, in addition to being, you know, pretty honorable fellow in most people's estimations, he's also a really good politician. So he's going to do things that are politically astute. And you may even look at it and go like, oh, he's kind of sneaky. I didn't really expect that from Lincoln. But he's going to do some things that the timing really seemed to matter, and the timing of the actions that he takes, or the reason he does what he does when he does it, is really to provide some advantage for the North in negotiation or in appearance, you know, whose fault certain things were, that kind of thing. So you may be excuse me, sorry, surprised that he's a little more of a political animal than you expect him to be. But you know, he's operating during a civil war, so he's got to make sure he knows what he's doing. All right, so Republican Party platform 1860. The Southerners would say it antagonized the start of the war, but the party platform says that they will oppose the spread of slavery into any new territories, and Lincoln is their nominee. Some Southern states react by saying, hey, we just won't put you on the ballot. And that way, if he is elected, they could say, we didn't vote for you, you're not our president, and they would be kind of accurate. You may or may not be aware that each state has different procedures to put nominees on the ballot for presidential elections. So you have to get petitions, certain number of signatures, that kind of thing. So each state can have their own rules, and they can change their own rules as well. Although you probably do notice that because you see states changing voting procedures right now, and it's a fairly controversial thing in some sectors. You've noticed that. All right, so Southern states did some of that kind of stuff during this time period to ensure that the Republican nominee wouldn't make it on the ballot. He didn't, and they didn't vote for him. The Democrats had 2 or 3 different folks running, so they split the votes. Lincoln gets elected, and then the Southern states go like, we're out. And they said, if Lincoln's the president, he's not our president, we'll secede. And they did. So you start with South Carolina. So South Carolina leaves the Union first. And just kind of gentle reminder, although I know that you know, because we just had one of these presidential elections. The election happens in 1 year, and the new guy takes office in the next year. So the election's 1860. Lincoln doesn't take office until 1861. I think in that era, I know in that era, their inaugurations are in April. We do it in January, honestly, to shorten that time between the election and the time the president takes office. So the guy leaving can't mess up as much stuff. That really is why they changed that. Can you imagine people messing stuff up for the next guy? Shocking, shocking. Okay. So Lincoln gets elected. Then South Carolina, right after the election, says, okay, we're out. Now, the president is a fellow named Buchanan, and Buchanan's goal is to not be president when the Civil War starts. So at this point, he's just like, I don't want to be the guy in charge when this starts. So when South Carolina secedes and several other states follow, I think it's a group of 8 at first, Buchanan really doesn't do anything, and they take over a federal fort, and he goes like, not my problem, and he just leaves it alone. He suggests that they shouldn't do that, and they go like, yeah, what are you going to do about it? And they know he's not going to do anything. So he decides just to leave it alone and let it be Lincoln's problem. So when Lincoln becomes president, he immediately, well, it's not the first thing he does, but he has a plan to resupply the fort. He says, it's a federal fort. Our soldiers are there, they need supplies, they need rations, so we're going to go make sure that they're taken care of. Knowing full well that if he sends troops to this fort, that the Southern troops who have taken over the fort will shoot at the federal troops. Well, once you shoot at federal troops, it's rebellion. And if you are in a state of rebellion, then the government has the duty, the obligation really, to suppress the rebellion. So what Lincoln's trying to do is make sure that he doesn't start stuff, because he just that's the way he wants it to look, like the other side started it. And technically the other side did start it, even not technically. They took over a federal fort in their state, but they of course didn't see it that way. They had seceded. It was no longer a federal fort, it was a Southern fort, you see. So, all right. So when Lincoln sends the troops in to resupply the fort, the Southern troops fire at those troops. He declares the South to be in rebellion, and then the war is officially on. You may or may not remember, we did something similar to this in the Mexican War. Do you remember? because Mexico said the boundary of Texas was the Nueces River. Texas said it was the Rio Grande or Rio Grande. So we sent troops between, we, the US, because I was there, sent troops between the two rivers, and that antagonized the Mexican troops to fire at them, and they went, oh, you fired at us, it's on. So it was on. Lincoln does a similar sort of thing. And if you're a Southern apologist, like you like the Confederacy more, you go like, well, Lincoln didn't have to do that. And I've even read, there was a book written about, it was during the Trump presidency, so it's probably, but right at the beginning, it was like 4 or 5 years ago by, I can't remember who it was, but some modern historian who's way right of center, who argued that Lincoln caused an unnecessary war. There are very few historians that think that. My guess is none of you are reading that book. I can't even remember who it was. I'm gonna have to look this up now that I'm thinking about it. But I didn't read the book because I thought, well, that's just almost crazy. But I don't know. I should have read it, right? To see if it was almost crazy or if he had some good points. Probably not. But see, I'm already too set in my ways. I'm not open-minded. I need to look at that book maybe. Okay, so the war starts and we start drafting people and it's messy. It's messy. Okay, so the war officially starts 1861. Now here's kind of a part of the answer to the weekly question, the advantages of the Confederacy. And these are pretty general. I think most people kind of know these, assume these, and you could talk about these in fairly general ways. I mean, you can add statistics as well. I think there are some in the book that talk about population numbers, that kind of thing. But the cause of the Confederacy was typically more, no, what's the right word? Inspirational, that's the word. Because you are trying to defend your way of life. The cause of the Union was preserve the Union. Like, yeah, whatever. Nobody's that excited about the Union, but preventing the dang Yankees from invading my house, that's inspiration. Yeah, so the South is going to see the North as invading, and the North is going to see the South as doing something they don't have permission to do. It's like breaking curfew, or it's much more serious, but South has a more inspirational cause. The South is fighting on their home field. So they're fighting a defensive war, and that gives them a couple of advantages. One, they know the territory better. And two, they don't have to go anywhere to fight. So it's going to be less expensive, less work, not as hard on the equipment, that sort of thing. Now, of course, the bad part about fighting on your home territory is your home territory gets blown up. So, I mean, there are disadvantages to that, but it is usually easier to fight a defensive war than an offensive war. Does that make sense? I'm shaking my head for you because I know it makes sense to you. Or stop working on your physics. Do you work on physics? Calculus? Stop it. Stop it. None of that stuff matters. You're all going to major in history. I know you are. All right. So defensive war, and then they may have had better military leadership. I know that's kind of nebulous and there's opinions and stuff, but people tended to like this Robert E. Lee fellow. You've probably heard of him. He graduated second in his class at West Point. That's pretty good. And I hear West Point's a good school, even though I didn't go there. I hear it's quite good. Southerners tended to, plantation owners tended to send kids to military schools. So honestly, they probably had more military leadership that had been trained in military colleges than the North did. Usually people in the North, there's more working class people that go to get out of poverty. In the South, it's more of a legacy kind of thing. So Robert E. Lee was one of those guys, distant relative of Washington, hence that college, Washington and Lee. Have you heard of that college? I had a student one time that got a full scholarship to that college, and she was really excited about it. And I told her she shouldn't go, which is terrible. Do your teachers ever tell you which college to go to or not? But I told her she shouldn't go because it's a really, really, really conservative college. And she had started the Gay Straight Alliance at the school I taught at. I just said, like, I don't know if this place is for you. And she went and she said, oh, I can't go there. And I went, yeah. But anyway, Washington and Lee were related. Yes. Okay. And fun fact, or maybe not fun fact, Robert E. Lee's plantation is really about the only Southern land that gets confiscated and not returned at the end of the war. Do you know what Robert E. Lee's land is turned into? See if you win the trivia contest. Does anybody know? You guys are not going to do well on the U.S. history section of Jeopardy. It is Arlington National Cemetery. Can you believe it? It's crazy. Or not crazy. Or you don't care. We'll keep going. He's a really good commander. Lots of the military leadership is from the South, so they probably have that advantage. And that's probably about it. Yeah, pretty much every other advantage belongs to the Union. But those are important advantages. And if you look at who's winning battles in the Civil War, you will notice that in the first 2 years, the Confederacy wins most of the battles. They do. So these advantages are pretty helpful. Now, the Confederacy's hope of winning is to win quickly. And their problems are the reason they needed to win quickly. Problem number one, there's more people in the North. A lot more people in the North. I think at least a third more. I'm, not in charge of counting all the population, but as I recall, there's at least a third more people in the North. And that means there's more people to fight. You can draft more people. You can tax more people. They also have more money, not just because there's more of them, but because they have a more diverse economy. So they have a very large agricultural sector, but they also have a very large industrial or business sector. The South, as we all know, is much more agricultural. But the problem with the Southern economy is what they grow. They grow cotton. If you're hungry, are you eating cotton? No. So they don't, I hope not. Are you eating cotton? There's not enough food in the South by the end of the war. Yeah. There was a weird diet that, oh my gosh, teenage girls, no offense, because I know some of you are teenage girls, and I was one, but they worry about how they look. Not you guys, you look great. And there was an era where the girls wanted to lose weight, so they wanted to have a high fiber diet, and God bless them, mostly middle school girls. They ate cotton because it's a high fiber. Yeah, it also completely clogs your colon. So if you ever, what, God bless them. That's not cool. All right, sorry, focus. Okay, but you can't eat cotton. It does, yeah, it causes problems. And they couldn't get Southern plantation owners to switch to growing food. Can you imagine? You got a whole bunch of poor guys fighting for you, and you're like, nope, we're not feeding them. That is crazy. I don't know. The Confederacy never made much sense to me, but I'm not really ingrained in it. And Civil War, it's not really my thing. But anyway, all right. So the North had more money, more people, an established government, so they don't have to start from scratch. They've got a president, they've got the military, they've got foreign affairs established. They've got international relationships, so they've got treaties and trade negotiations. They got all kinds of stuff going on. They have a navy. The South doesn't really have one of those. It's not a great navy, but it's still a navy. And they'll use that navy to block Southern trade. So the guys who do want to sell their cotton overseas, it's going to be really hard for them. It is. And if I recall correctly, there were Northern battleships who actually captured the Jefferson Davis and some of his officials when they were trying to go overseas to negotiate stuff. And they held them for a while until a foreign country said, let them go. So they did. It was really hard, because you couldn't really telephone anybody, and we didn't have that transcontinental telegraph yet. So unless you went overseas, you really couldn't negotiate. So it was really hard for the South to negotiate with foreign countries, to make treaties or get allies. Yeah. And certainly there were nations who would want to recognize the South, especially nations who liked buying cotton, primarily France and England. But because the North blocked the commerce and made it hard for them to communicate with each other, those nations ended up buying cotton from somewhere else. And we'll talk about that quite a bit when we talk about the next chapter, because it messes with the Southern economy forever, until World War II. So for a really long time. Actually, like before you guys were born, before I was born too, the South was just incredibly poor. I mean, it was just people didn't move to the South because, well, one, it was too hot and we didn't have air conditioning, but it was incredibly poor and the schools were bad and all that kind of stuff because it was poor. And you need money to have good schools. And yeah. And part of the reason it's incredibly poor is the Civil War. Most of the destruction happens in the South and it completely ruins the Southern economy. All right, and both the North and the South are going to have inflation, they're going to have some issues, but the North is much better able to manage it because their economy is larger and more diverse. There's some manufacturing already in the North, and they're going to pick it up and have more manufacturing, and they're going to be able to build factories and stuff much faster because they have more natural resources or that sort of resource, and they also have trains and it just works better in the North because they already have the infrastructure, not as much in the South. Now, the South will develop some manufacturing during this time period, to make guns and bullets because you got to have those for war. So it will help the South to develop a manufacturing industry, but it'll remain small, honestly, until World War II. Yeah, World War II is the big change for the Southern economy. All right, and food. They got a lot more food in the North. And students always seem to misunderstand this because I think in any student's mind, the South is a big farm and the North is a big factory during the Civil War. And the South is mostly a big cotton plantation, but not a lot of food. I mean, you grow your own food, but it's not food for export or for large numbers of people. And the guys who stay home to grow the food have been drafted. So they really have food shortages. They really do in the South. And most of the food really is produced kind of Ohio Valley region and middle of the country. So we're talking Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. If you've driven up there, you know the states that are a giant cornfield. Yeah, they're like a giant cornfield and one city. It's all those vowel states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa. And then my home state, Missouri, is kind of like that. Kansas is a little like that. Nebraska, but yeah. Anyway, you get the idea. All right, so northern and southern advantages. The South wins most of the battles for the first 2 years, then you'll see a shift kind of toward the end of 1863. It's 1862, excuse me. And then by 1863 and beyond, it's pretty much obvious that the North is going to win. All right. One of my all-time favorite students was really smart and graduated with a 4.0 and full college scholarship and 4.0 in nursing school, hated history. Can you imagine? I'm shocked by it as well. But super, super nice, just gentle kind of student. And she asked me, I still remember AP US History, Miss Serna, how many sides are there in the Civil War? And I went, really nice student, there's 2. And she said, Miss Serna, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I think you're wrong. And I went, okay, why do you think I'm wrong? And she said, because I was reading about this and I was talking to my dad about this. And there's like the North and the South, but there's the Union and the Confederacy. And then there's some Yankees and Rebels, and there's gray and blue. And I went, just a bunch of nicknames for the same 2 teams. So just in case you're like that student and your Civil War is not your thing, all the names for the North, there's probably more, are kind of listed here. So the North, the Union, US, the Yankees, the blue, and the South, Confederacy, Rebels, the gray. And of course, you know, probably, maybe, that the uniforms are blue and gray. Yeah. I think there's a football game every year that's the blue and the gray, but I forget who plays in that football game. I don't pay that much attention to college football. Don't be upset. I know we're in Texas. All right. First few years of the war, the South wins most of the major battles. And I will ask you some questions about a couple of important battles, but I believe that I list those. I'm sorry if you're scrolling down. I hope I didn't make you dizzy. Yep, there we go. Major battles, kind of toward the end. So, dang, there's a lot of stuff that goes on during the Civil War, isn't there? All right. So, sorry. So we were here first few years of the war. South prevails in most major battles, but then they run out of stuff and they can't really resupply and they can't buy stuff from foreign countries and they can't export their cotton. So dang, they're in trouble. So that's when they're going to start drafting more and confiscating, and we'll talk about that later. So the soldiers will just go through people's plantations and just take the stuff they want. And the South ends up really impoverished, and Southerners will start to abandon the military because they want to go home and protect their families and their farms, that sort of thing. So it's messy, messy, messy stuff. Also, Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation Proclamation, I think everybody's vaguely familiar with it. It's where Lincoln frees the slaves, kind of, sort of. So he frees the slaves in the states that don't pay any attention to him. So I know, most of the northern states don't have slavery, but count them, 4 border states still have slavery. My home state of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. That's what those initials stand for. Postal initials, postal initials, back in the day when we sent mails to each other, a long time ago. So those 4 states still had slaves, but they were part of the Union. And Lincoln didn't demand that those slaves be freed because he didn't want those states to join the Confederacy. It was sort of a accommodation, or I don't know what the right word would be, but let them keep their slaves. So Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, but he does not free the slaves in those 4 states. So he frees the slaves in all of the rebellious states. So every southern state, he says, okay, slavery's not legal in the South anymore. All the slaves are freed. None of the southern states are paying any attention to Lincoln. So it doesn't really matter that he freed the slaves legally. Doesn't really matter, at least yet. Now it will matter once the Union's back together. Plus they'll pass an amendment to kind of cover this as well. But even though it looks like this is kind of a weird thing to do, it has some really interesting side effects that are very helpful to the Union. Side effect number 1, changes the focus of the war from preserving the Union to ending slavery. And if you're wondering, does that matter to anybody? Nearly 200,000 people it mattered to. About 200,000 free Blacks joined the military because now it's their opportunity to take a part in ending slavery. And they can do this by volunteering for the military. If you're wondering, in the middle of a war, would 200,000 new soldiers help? Dramatically. Now, at first, they wouldn't let them participate in combat, but that doesn't last for long, in part because Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln negotiate with each other. Frederick Douglass goes around the country recruiting new African-American soldiers, and this turns out to be quite a bonus for the Union Army. At first, the soldiers aren't treated so well. They're not paid equal wages, that sort of thing. But after a short period of time, those things improve. And I know some of you are going like, well, if we improve those then, why do we go back to other ways later? That's all about the next chapter. So that won't be fun, but you'll see some progress in this chapter and you go like, hey, we're on the right track. And then we go like, just kidding. And it'll take us another 80 years to get back on the right track. Messy stuff. All right, so bonus number 1 of the Emancipation Proclamation, nearly 200,000 new soldiers join the war effort for the North because of it. Number 2, if you free the slaves in the South and you've changed the focus of the war to ending slavery, guess who else you have to free? You got to free the slaves in the North as well. So they begin the process of gradual emancipation, which will be completed before the war is over. So even though it doesn't immediately free the slaves in the North, it will within the next year. So it leads to gradual emancipation in the North. And that gradual emancipation is honestly pretty quick for U.S. history standards. Okay, all right. All right, and then Frederick Douglass, just don't forget about him. He consults regularly with Abraham Lincoln at the White House and at Douglass's house in DC. It's called Cedar Hill. And those guys, it's within walking distance, so they can walk to each other's houses or ride carriages or whatever people did back then. Ride a horse, donkey, no donkey in DC, probably. I don't know. But it was close enough they could walk. Yeah, and when we can all travel again and explore things, should go to DC and look at these things. I don't know, you can walk to the White House right now or even in a little while, but Frederick Douglass's house is a cool place to go if you ever get to go to DC or get to go again or however that works. All right, Lincoln and Douglass, not the Lincoln Douglas debate guy, but Frederick Douglass. We'll talk about issues of race pretty consistently. Douglass's insistence that African American soldiers be treated equally will have an impact on Lincoln, who will also insist on that. And since he's the president, that matters quite a bit. Frederick Douglass's son will fight in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which is the Glory movie regiment. If you've seen that movie, that's a really, I don't know that fun is the right word, but well-made Civil War movie. It sort of starts off with some guy losing a body part because of a cannonball, so it's probably not the best thing to show if you're ever a US history teacher in a public school. However, it's not super accurate, but it's still really inspirational. At the end of that movie, everyone dies. But in real life, they did send them into some pretty sticky situations, so their casualty rate was about 50%. But people do, yeah, they don't all die. But you know, in the war, in the movie, they do. All right, so Frederick Douglass's son is in that regiment, and Douglass goes around the country recruiting soldiers, and his service is pretty invaluable to the North during the Civil War. And it's also going to raise the public profile of African Americans in government. So Douglass, I mean, he's a force, I'm just saying. All right, during the Civil War, whose rights are protected? Yeah, not the average person's. So I mentioned here that civilian rights are somewhat limited. Now, if you do stuff that the government agrees with, your rights are not limited. I know that's really not saying much, is it? But the North is going to declare martial law in many instances, especially in the border states, when they're doing the emancipation, especially then, and at the beginning of the war to kind of keep people in check. And also in Illinois and Indiana, where there were just lots of weird, I don't know, not weird, uncharacteristic challenges to the federal government, where both of those states had secession movements. And if you look at the map, those don't seem like the logical states to secede, because they're really not anywhere near the Mason-Dixon line. But they have secession movements to the point where this one guy in Indiana, this Lambton Milligan guy, Lincoln just says, I can't take this dude anymore, arrest him. And so they throw him in jail and sentence him to death because he wants Indiana to secede and he won't stop talking about it. So they suspended the writ of habeas corpus. You go like, that is terrible. So the writ of habeas corpus is when we charge you, not you, of course, but when someone gets charged with a crime, they can't arrest them unless they tell them, or hold them in custody unless they tell them the charges against them. So if you suspend the writ of habeas corpus, you can be held without being charged. So they arrest Lambton Milligan, don't tell him why, they keep him for quite a while, and then tell him he's being charged with treason, give him a court-martial, a military trial, and then sentence him to death. He's going to appeal that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to say, yeah, or something like that. The Supreme Court says, no, you can't do that. People can lose some of their rights during war, but not those. So the Supreme Court said that even in the case of a war, you can't suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and you can't deny all of your 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendment rights. You're going like, what about the 7th? That's when you get sued. So they didn't sue him, but Fourth has to do with Fourth Amendment is when they arrest you, they have to tell you the charges against you. Fifth Amendment is they can't, you can't be forced to testify against yourself. That's the one kids always remember. But it also says that they can't violate due process of law without breaking the law. So if they remove your life, liberty, or property without following all the rules, then they've broken the law. The Sixth Amendment says you have a right to face your accusers and that you can have witnesses and a lawyer to defend yourself. And the Eighth Amendment says is a protection against cruel and unusual punishment, like getting executed because you want your state to secede. The South also practiced martial law and confiscation, and probably overall were harsher in some ways, although this Milligan example is pretty bad. Now, the South is going to put people in much harsher prison situations as well. So, yeah, if you get arrested, because there'll be certain parts of the South that don't want to secede. It's how we get West Virginia. I don't know if you knew that. West Virginia becomes a state during the Civil War because that's the part of Virginia where they didn't have slaves. They go like, nope, isn't for us. And so the little Appalachian area, the mountain area, and they go like, we're out. So that's where a whole bunch of deserters go as well. So West Virginia is still kind of seen as, it has a reputation of being a little rowdy kind of place. I don't know. No offense if you're from there. Are you from there? My stepmom is from there. She's rowdy. She is. She would freely admit it. All right, but she's not that old. I'm not suggesting she was around during the Civil War. All right, other stuff that's going on during this time period. This to me is one of the most amazing things about the Civil War and the federal government. They're doing all kinds of stuff in addition to fighting the Civil War. So we're going to buy Alaska. We're going to plan the Transcontinental Railroad. We're going to start a whole bunch of colleges. We're going to send people out to the West. And some of you talked about this in your weekly question, the free land, free soil thing. You go like, oh, we even give away free land. A lot of those here's some free land bills happened during the Civil War. We're also going to harass Native Americans during the Civil War, build more railroads. We're going to do all kinds of stuff. So, all right, so non-Civil War activities that are important include the Morrill Land Grant Act, which has the federal government selling federal land and using that money from the sale of federal land. They keep a little chunk of it to plan colleges like A&M or A&I colleges. If I recall, the A&M is often agricultural and mechanical, but sometimes it's agricultural and mining. And then the A&I is usually agricultural and industrial. Purchase of Alaska from Russia, which expands US territory really dramatically. I hate to even say this out loud, but it's bigger than Texas, really big. Now, nobody lives there because, you know, it's not really a big island in the middle of the ocean like we see on our maps sometimes. It's north of Canada. Who wants to live there? That is cold stuff. All right, I hear it's pretty though. All right, so we buy Alaska. And the reason we buy Alaska, we don't know. Because Russia's going to take it if we don't. Yeah. We don't know there's a whole bunch of gold there. And we surely don't know there's a whole bunch of oil there. We find all that stuff out later. But it really was to give us more coastline access and control of trade and maybe some military advantages. And we end up getting some bonus things from buying Alaska. They sort of made fun of it in the era and said it was Frigidia and that the cows gave ice cream instead of milk, but that would be cool if that were actually true. But it wasn't, sadly. All right, so we buy Alaska and we plan the Transcontinental Railroad from Omaha to Sacramento. Omaha's Nebraska, Sacramento, California. Congress passes the Homestead Act, which gives a bunch of free land away, millions and millions of acres to something like 5 million families. And the land is practically free. I think it costs like $5 to register it, but you know that really poor people can't take the free land because you have to have enough money to travel out there and have all the supplies. So this really helps kind of upper middle class families that want to farm in the West. And a lot of these are immigrant kind of folks who would come in the 1840s and 50s. A lot of those German and Norwegish and Norwegian and Swedish. I combined the words, didn't I? Immigrants. Yeah, the people that live in cold places. They'll go to the Pacific Northwest and get a lot of that land. So the government wants to fill up the land so that we can contain Native Americans onto reservations and control the territory better. So it's not necessarily just for economic opportunity, although certainly the people taking the land will see it that way. Several million families relocate, about a third of them keep the farm, the other 2/3 probably sell to the 1/3 who keep the farm, and then they'll start a business or something in the city. And so, yeah, so we end up with a lot of farms in the West. And other business opportunities that seem to develop during this time period have to do with the Civil War. So a couple of really famous dudes make a bunch of money. Cornelius Vanderbilt runs steamship lines, railroads, helps build telegraph lines, usually along the railroad lines, dramatically increases his fortune. Also, I think his oldest son dies in the Civil War, which makes him, sad, as it should. Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller will gain some government contracts to supply metal, iron and steel, petroleum products for Rockefeller during the war, and that will also enhance their fortunes. So more people making money. And this is about where I stopped in the other class, so I'll probably stop about here as well, just to kind of do the same thing in both classes. But not everything in the North is perfect. Not everything in the North is perfect, even though they are winning the war. Some people are frustrated, especially in large cities like New York, Chicago, Baltimore, Boston, that African Americans were not being drafted. So white people were being drafted and black people were not. So when the white guys got drafted, the black guys often took their jobs. And this seemed to be frustrating to people who lived in those communities. So you would have draft riots. And the draft riots really pitted poor white people against free black people, to the point where the poor white people would go and attack the neighborhoods. There's an instance too in this riot where the poor white people go and burn down an orphanage filled with black kids. So this is really super ugly stuff. And the book will mention too that some of this really is frustration because wealthier, like upper middle class and above white people in the North can just pay a fee and their kids don't get drafted. So there's a lot of economic discrimination in the draft. And for whatever reason, the poor white people see the free black people as beneficiaries of that. So rather than taking their frustrations out on their government or electing new officials or being frustrated with the people who set up the system, they take it out on poor or working class black folks, which is pretty ugly stuff. Yeah. All right, this is probably a good place to stop for a moment or two and see if you guys have any questions. So we'll talk much more about the weekly question next time. I promise. So weekly question talk is next time. Now, before we go, do you guys have any questions or anything you want to ask? I know we still have a couple minutes, so you might want to ask anything. Okay, I'm going to stop recording.